Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's WTS Philadelphia program. My name is Erica Antone. I am the president of our WTS chapter, and we're going to get started. First, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize our chapter sponsors. Our programming and operations could not move forward without this support. At the platinum level, we have AECOM, Burns Engineering, GPI, HDR, Jacobs, STV Incorporated, Traffic Planning and Design, and Urban Engineers. At our Trailblazer sponsor level, we have CNS Engineers, Gannett Fleming, HNTB, JMT, Michael Baker International, Pegasus Financial Planning, Pannoni, Taylor Wiseman Taylor, and WSP. Our champion sponsors include Hatch LTK Engineering Services, Remington and Bernick Engineers, RS&H, Rabinski Engineering, Sawinski Sullivan Architects and Engineers, Stokes Creative Group, and TY Lin. At the advocate sponsor level, Aero Aggregates, Aurora Engineers, Bergman Associates, Dewberry, General Highway Products, Kimley Horn and Associates, KMJ Consulting, Langen Engineering, McMahon Associates, Promatech, RK&K, Stantec, Trans Systems Corporation, and WRA. Our DBE sponsors are Arrow Land Solutions, Bree and Associates, Dovetail Cultural Resource Group, Drive Engineering, Hunt Engineering Company, JBC Associates, KS Engineers, Malik and Shear, NTM Engineering, Susquehanna Civil, and the Lighting Practice. And finally, our current agency partners include Amtrak, the Delaware River Joint Toll Bridge Commission, the City of Philadelphia Office of Transportation Infrastructure and Sustainability, Philiport, and Philadelphia International Airport. A special thank you to Kelly Freeman, the director of our WTS Programs Committee, and Christina I'm sorry, I cannot get your last name correctly.
Carl, you got it.
Who is our event planner today. So I'm gonna pass it over to Christina to do the honors of our intros.
Great, thanks so much, Erica. It is my pleasure to be here today. My name is Christina Arlt. In addition to being on the WTS Philadelphia Programs Committee, I am also a senior project manager with McCormick Taylor in their Planning and Communications group. It is my pleasure to introduce Betsy Mastaglio, the manager of the Office of Transit, Bicycle, and Pedestrian Planning at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Betsy is an urban designer and landscape architect with expertise in streetscape design, pedestrian and bicycle mobility, smart corridor planning, green infrastructure design, transit and station area planning, master planning, bridge architecture, and environmentally sensitive site design. She brings to her projects a strong ability to manage interdisciplinary project teams, communicate through graphic illustrations, and incorporate functional urban design, artist participation, and public involvement from a project's visioning phase through to construction document. So before I turn it over to Betsy, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat. We will have time at the end of the presentation where we'll ask the audience questions of the panelists. So Betsy, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to this panel.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Erica. I'm so glad to be here today on the kickoff to a weekend. It's so great to be able to hear from these scales from the national all the way to a much more local level. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists here for this afternoon. First up, we have Torsha Bhattacharya, who heads the Rails to Trails Conservancy data collection and analysis efforts as its director of research. She oversees a national effort to quantify the numerous benefits of trails to help make the case for trail building, increased walking and bicycling among all sections of society. Her research interests include exploring the relationship between built environment and health, national planning and policy for active transportation infrastructure, equity and social justice issues in transportation planning. Prior to joining the Rails to Trails Conservancy, Torsha was an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Very cool. She earned her master's degree and PhD in urban and regional planning from Florida State University. Welcome, Torsha. And I'll go ahead and introduce everybody now, and then we'll start the conversation. Also with us today is Frank Maguire. Frank Maguire is the program director of the Trails and Outdoor Recreation at the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, or PEC, where he oversees a team of 7 that helps groups across the state advance their trail projects. His work is focused on several large-scale trail initiatives, including the Industrial Heartlands Trails Coalition and the Circuit Trails, as well as managing the Pennsylvania Water Trails program. He serves on DCNR's Trails Advisory Committee and is the vice chair of PennDOT's Pedestrian and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Hi, Frank. And then finally today joining us is also Jeannette Brugger, who's joining us by phone. And Jeannette has over 10 years, Jeannette is the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator for the city of Philadelphia. And Jeannette has 10 years of experience in the planning field in the Philadelphia region in the public and private and nonprofit sectors. She focuses on pedestrian, bicycle, and trail network planning and implementation. She coordinates public agency and stakeholder interests to maintain and grow infrastructure for Philadelphians using all transportation modes. Jeannette's passion for city planning grew from attending New York University, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Design Studies and a minor in politics. She then attended the University of Pennsylvania, where she earned a Master of City Planning. Jeannette is a member of the American Planning Association and the Association for Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. Welcome, Jeannette. So it's lunchtime and it's Friday. That's the end of the reading. We're going to kick it off to a much more open dialogue now. And I guess just to get us loosened up and to start things off, I thought since we're here today to talk about trails and potentially mode shifts, let's kick it off with the trail question. And it's a softball one. I'm curious what your favorite trail is. It could be anywhere. And I'll go first. My favorite trail is the Kenwood Heritage Trail. And I say that selfishly because I live in the area. So particularly, we're always out there, but during this last year, it's really saved our physical and mental health having that out there. So I'm so grateful to have access to that. So panelists, what's your favorite trail?
I can go first in the panelists. My favorite trail, a picture background here, is the Mount Vernon Trail. It goes from Mount Vernon Estate to the Roosevelt Island, about 18 miles. And I love it because the city is near it and you can see the water, you can see Washington, D.C. skyline. And my kid loves the Gravelly Point where you can see the planes take off and land. So it's an awesome trail to be on.
I'll go ahead and jump in next. For me, the Great Allegheny Passage going from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland, really makes the case across the board for what's possible with trails in terms of connecting long distance communities, revitalization, creating economic benefits, but also just the experience itself is huge. And the fact that you can take it from Pittsburgh all the way down to Washington, D.C. when you combine it with the C&O Canal really makes it an amazing investment and experience for everybody to enjoy. So.
Nice. Jeannette?
If Jeanette's on the phone, she might need to be unmuted by the host.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me now?
We got you. Thanks, Jeannette.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so my favorite trail, also selfishly, I'm going to say what's in my backyard, or not that far at least, is Forbidden Drive. And one reason is because so many different types of trail users use it, whether it's horses. I've seen somebody on a horse-drawn buggy, like a cart, kind of an old racing cart. People walking, people running, and people biking. So I love that it's kind of a cross-section of all trail users, and it's a little oasis, natural oasis in the city. So I love Forbidden Drive.
I love it too. It's fantastic. Okay, so thanks for weighing in on your favorite trails, and I love seeing in the chat some of your favorite trails too. Maybe it's a suggestion for those of you listening in to try a new one. So after that softball, let's get big picture and to the meat of things about what we're here to talk about today, which is the effect of the pandemic on trails and bicycle and pedestrian activity. So if you could each take a few minutes maybe to walk through what you've seen from your vantage point and your perspective on the changes in bicycle and pedestrian behavior that you've seen during the pandemic. Where have you seen increases? Have you seen any decreases? If you could tell us what it is that you're seeing, and maybe we'll start at the national scale. And Torsha, if you want to talk to us a little bit about what you've seen.
Sure. So what I'll do is quickly share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see it. Okay, perfect. So we have trail counters all over the country, and we have been collecting trail data since before the pandemic, much before the pandemic started, from 2016 to current. And what that has allowed us to do is compare and contrast how the pandemic has impacted trail use. And nationally, what we are seeing is that the trail usage patterns have changed quite a bit. More people are out and about on trails now, but less so for going to work or for utilitarian purposes, as we like to call it. And more people are out on trails for recreational fun, outing with family, mental health, stress release purposes. So this chart that you can see here, the blue bars are 2019 and the orange ones 2020. Overall, we see that there is a significant increase in trail usage, but also the pattern that you see has changed. There's the peaks that we see generally in afternoon and morning times, when people going and coming back from work, that has kind of evened out and become a more U-shaped curve. The same thing that we see across days is that throughout all days, trail use has significantly increased over time. And we have compared and contrasted the usage, and significantly about over the 2 years, 2019 and 2020, what we saw was an average of about 50% increase in trail usage. What it does eclipse is the fact that there has been a significant decrease in people going to work or utilitarian purpose usage, but the percent decrease in that has been kind of shadowed by the significant increase we see in recreational use. So that to me was the highlight of the patterns that we saw.
And so at the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, we decided we wanted to capture what all the anecdotal evidence we were hearing about trail use last spring increasing. We wanted to try and see if we could quantify that a little bit. So we did a few things. One, we surveyed trail managers across the state to try and get what their impressions were. We did that first in May of last year, and then we actually ran the study again in the fall so we could try and capture a full year of impacts. So that survey, there were 18 questions in it. It was mostly qualitative information, but we did also ask if they were, if the trail managers were using trail counters. So we were able to collect some 30 different trail counters from across the state. That includes the Rails to Trails Conservancy with DCNR's help has trail counter stations throughout the state. DVRPC has great information as well. But then there were other individuals out there using things like, in addition to eco counters, we're also using traffics counters, so more mobile setups. Even one group that was using a game camera to capture the use. What we did is we tried to focus on a 3-year pattern between 2018, 2019, and 2020 when we looked at the data to see if we could detect any trends. And as you know, basically what we were hearing was held out by the data. Traffic started much earlier in May. April was huge. As things went through the summer, there was still an increase in the year-over-year use, but it wasn't as significant. There seemed to be a ceiling, and much as Torsha said, you know, as people weren't commuting, those numbers were offset by recreation. And again, we're using it, had to do that through more anecdotal evidence because our trail use counters just give us numbers. So there were some interesting things in those patterns too. So a trail like the 202 Parkway Trail in Bucks County had a dramatic increase, and it's not a very long trail. It's, you know, 8.5 miles. It does connect to some other ones, so you can make a little bit of a pattern. But the biggest thing about it is it's closer to suburban neighborhoods. It, you know, when people are looking for close to home recreation, the numbers increased by almost 200% when we looked at it a month like April of 2020. Throughout the year, it was about 147% up. When you compare that to Schuylkill Banks, from the DVRPC numbers, Schuylkill Banks saw a dramatic decrease in use. And when you think about it, you know, it's a center city. So if the people aren't going there through the day, going downtown for work, they may not be going there for their lunch hour or just commuting on it. But there was also an article in the Inquirer on April 14th that referred to it as a COVID petri dish, which is not exactly the PR you want for a trail. And obviously with some of the, with MLK Drive opening up and sort of people shifting to there, it explains the decrease. But, you know, the pattern overall was definitely through the year, numbers were way up, and from the managers themselves, it was mostly a positive. They saw the increase in use as a positive. So, hand it off to Jeannette.
Thank you, Frank. Unfortunately, we don't have the benefit of Torsha and Frank in terms of, you know, having a trail counter across a trail, and that's how you get your counts. When you look at on-road bike and pedestrian networks, it's a lot more spread out than that, of course, as all your professionals on the phone know. So, you know, we have a couple touch points of data gathering, and thank goodness for the data gatherers. DVRPC in specific, our touchstone of who really helps us out with this, but we all know that you know, recreation and work travel patterns have changed so much. Especially most of us on the phone are white collar workers, and we're working you know, at home now. So, you know, with the travel patterns changing, of course, so do the on-road pedestrian and bicycle patterns. And what we've seen anecdotally and from a data perspective is Center City has a lot less, of course, pedestrian traffic. Folks aren't, you know, taking the train in every day and walking around Center City. But also the peaks have changed a little bit, and we've been able to get some data from DVRPC and Betsy and Cascade Pool, and just provided something really interesting this week about new bike counters on Spruce and Pine Street, and they're actually showing more bike traffic than the SRT right now, right downtown on Schuylkill Banks, and the peak is spread out. So, you know, it's right on the money with what Torsha and Frank said, that the peaks are different, and the types of travel are different. And again, there are some limitations to that data. A counter can't ask a person whether they're going to work or just going for a ride. But we're really seeing some interesting data coming, and I think this will be something for us to study for a long time.
Thanks, everybody. It's so great to hear too, like how different the different ways that you're gathering this information, both from the counters and kind of the collaboration it takes to gather that information and what you're seeing through observation. I wanted to also point out that if you go to DVRPC's news page, it's a particular tab We do have a couple of segments where we reported on some of the things, in particular that Frank pointed out too, the changes in variation on what we're seeing on particular trails. The Schuylkill River Trail was, that April thing was real when that article came out. I think it also was just really heightened for all of us in the pandemic of kind of staying in, but the neighborhood bikes activity that we saw was huge. And to what Jeannette was referring to, we hope to have something up either today or Monday on the Spruce and Pine bike lane. So a little bit more in-road data for. So let's jump to another topic. I think in this last year, we've been so interested in the pandemic. It's taken up much of our conversation, but of course, safety is always a conversation that we're having in transportation and in trail use. And I wonder if any of you have seen any changes to safety for peds and bikes, if anything's changed with these volumes or through the pandemic, and kind of what challenges remain for us on the safety front. And I'll hand that to anyone who wants to start first.
I'll start if that's okay. I don't think this is, again, a surprise to anyone on the phone, but or on the call, on the presentation, that 2020 was one of the worst on-road, at least safety, traffic safety years we've seen in a long time. And when we talk about lower vehicle volumes or different peaks, you got a lot. Again, just in a very general sense, if there's more capacity and less traffic, you get more aggressive driving, right? And I know this is a bike and ped conversation, but when I deal with on-road safety, I think about how fast cars are going or how safely they're going and driving, and how that relates to bike and ped. So that's something we've really had to think about differently. We're always, again, focused on the design of bike and ped facilities as they relate to vehicles. But when you think about how folks access trails as well, if you're lucky enough to have a 5-block, trip to a trail, or a 15-block trip to a trail, it's going to impact, whether you're going to go to that trail or not. So we've been thinking more, though that's always my job, but we've been thinking more about, how to make those small gaps between high quality bike facilities or high quality pedestrian facilities and trails, how to close those small gaps. Because that's really important to get people to use trails. So that's what I've been focused on.
I would echo some of what Jeannette's saying, because I think with the increased use, we also know that there were a lot of first-time users and returning users. And one of the big things within bicycle advocacy has always been, how do you get people that may own bikes and use them once a year to even get to the small increment of using them 2-3 times a year? And so what came out of this and how we are using the reports that the Pennsylvania Environmental Council did was trying to change the narrative around our work to much more of an infrastructure perspective, and that people want these safe places to recreate, these safe places to travel, and that it really is part of thinking about it as a network and not just as kind of like a nice thing to have as an amenity. A lot of where we saw the crowding issues and the problems with the increase in use was at trailheads and entrances, and any place that people were congregating, people felt less safe from pandemic spread or just any number of issues. So thinking about how the trail network is more connected into communities, changing the narrative around that is one of the ways that we're hoping to address safety, because the outdoor industry is reporting massive spikes in sales of gear and equipment because of this year. And, this is a cultural shift, or an opportunity for a cultural shift for people to rethink how they get outside, when they get outside, and how do we keep those people feeling like this is what they want to be doing. I think goes a long way to this question.
I'll chime in next and agree with most of, almost all of what Jeannette and Frank mentioned. The one other trend that we saw was a lot of demand for closing down streets. So a lot of cities actually signed on to open streets and making car-only streets open to pedestrians. But on the other side, what we saw was some of the parks were being closed down because of overcrowding issues. So I think the perspective and how we think about open space needs to change. Instead of closing down parks and trails, I think the better option or better response is opening up more space to make sure people have a way to go outside, walk or bike in a safe manner. Because we saw people going out for their lunch break, taking a walk right outside. Kids out on streets biking. So at the same time, because the number of cars reduced, the cars that were traveling started traveling at a higher speed. So there were more pedestrians on pedestrians and bicyclists using these spaces, and cars driving at a higher speed. That's kind of a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, what we saw was there was an increase in accidents and in multiple places. So I think it's a positive, but it can only sustain itself if we provide these interconnected networks of trails where people don't have to hop on and hop off a trail or get in their car to get to a trail and then use a trail. So as long as we can provide that easy access right out the door, just like we have come to expect street networks to be connected and not just follow the earth. Similarly, we have to start expecting, and I think there's a lot of grassroots demand for that now, is we want those interconnected, safe from traffic spaces.
I think that you're right. I hope that we've seen so many new cyclists and people walking places that there is an increased demand for safer facilities, and not just on trails. We want interconnected trails, but we really, those on-road facilities, if we're going to get people to change over their modes for different trips. So on-road facilities, you know, in that safe space from cars, that we'll really have to push for. So thank you, each of you, for that response. Another thing this year has certainly, it's been a year of conversations around both public health and equity of racial justice. And those, you know, are first and foremost in our minds. And if we look at modes and pedestrians and cyclists and access to trails, how might we as professionals, when we're looking at this, how might we approach our planning and design and our advocacy for trails in order to improve on both public health and racial justice? Is it a question about equitable access or greater protection? What do you think we should all be focused on towards that end? And again, I'll throw it out to whomever would like to answer that first.
I can go first. So we did a national level study of what people were experiencing in terms of barriers to trail use, as we know that trail use is not as diverse as we would like it to be. It's not reflective of the population of the country. So we wanted to know what were the motivators and what were preventing people from using trails. And motivators seem to be universal: social connection, getting your family and friends there, having fun, being close to nature, recreation, those kind of positive benefits, connected across gender, race, income, education levels, as well as whether people lived in urban or rural areas. But what we saw when we looked at the barriers that were preventing people from accessing trails varied. Females were more likely to say that they were scared of being harassed on trails, especially at night. So lighting and maintenance of trails, eyes on the street or trails, were important to them. Whereas African Americans were more likely to say that they felt that their actions were judged on the trails and they did not belong in those spaces. They didn't feel that the trail was for them. So I think these are real and perceived assumptions of how we see others on trails and who we expect more of. So we have the work cut out for us, but one thing I think we should all be mindful of is that because of the mental health benefits and the physical health benefits that trails provide, we as advocacy organization, we should not always tout these tangible benefits, like go out on trails, you will save so many dollars, or go out on trails, it's good for you, good for your health. Sometimes there's a disconnect in how people think about going on trails, mostly because they want to have a good time or relax, than immediately thinking that, oh, it will lower my blood pressure. So I think changing the narrative of how we give them the pill is very important. So programming on the trail, marketing, being reflective of the community that you're serving, and not blaming or shaming for the behavior, I think might go a long way in increasing diversity of trail users and making sure there's equity in terms of trail access.
Yeah, I strongly agree with everything Torsha just said. The Circuit Trails Coalition just completed, through their JEDI task force, a marketing survey of trail users in some particularly focused areas where there was basically disadvantaged populations, and trying to see what their perceptions of the trails were. And these are places that the trails already exist. So what were the barriers for them to getting out on the trails? And I know this is kind of a transportation conversation, but almost nobody in that market survey brought up the idea of the trails getting you from point A to point B. What the people who were using the trails saw them as gathering spaces, saw them as places for them to experience nature. It was just someplace outside the home that they liked. And even the people who were not using the trails, what they wanted was the opportunities to gather, to have those kind of spaces where they were, to some of what Torsha just said, that they feel part of a community, they can gather, they can talk with friends. Particularly in the time of COVID, outdoor spaces were perceived as being healthier. So how do we keep encouraging those as we build out trail networks and rethink some of the ways we use them? In our surveys with trail managers, there was a lot of a reporting of demographic shifts of users. Now, we left that kind of question broadly, and we did we had an open-ended statement attached to it. And a lot of what people referred to as demographic shifts were more people were getting out as family units, that they were, spending more time on the trails. It wasn't just the solo recreational, runner or bike rider. And so thinking about the spaces that we create, not as being just getting from point A to point B, but how people actually spend time in those spaces, I think goes a long way to sort of changing the narrative around it. And I know we, as an organization, we always measure our accomplishments in mileage completed. And now we're just trying to think about how do we change that? What is it? Is it more about the connections than it is just the mileage? So.
Yeah, I think Frank and Torsha, you're right on the money. It's not about mileage. You're absolutely right. It's about, what are we connecting to? And in my work, it's like, hey, we just added a half a mile on Parkside Avenue, but what's on either side of that? What does it connect to? And until we have a network and we start closing those gaps between, not just high quality bike network, but also how do we connect those directly to the trail? Because those same historically underserved communities that we're trying to connect to, that we're talking about, increasing our resources in, are also historically those communities were presently even those communities with higher health disparities and with more high injury network streets, where 80% of the crashes in the city of Philadelphia are happening on 12% of the streets. So how do we bring that all together and focus our investments on places that need it most? And I think we all know that there are so many different definitions of what's needed most, and also opportunistic, investments when it comes to what I do. If something's being repaved, we're going to focus there if it's on a high injury network, right? But that's not necessarily, what does need mean? So there are so many different lenses to look at this through. One thing we have done in Philadelphia is that I do want to highlight is through our Better Bike Share partnership, Indigo Bike Share is really focusing in our their expansion plans on historically underserved areas in West Philly, in North Philly, and in South Philly and Grace Ferry and Point Breeze. And that's, adding a transportation mode to those neighborhoods that wasn't there before. And I think that's a really important point. And we did see a lot of a spike in Indigo bike share users during, specifically during the beginning of the pandemic when folks were less comfortable on an enclosed transit bus, right? So kind of spreading out to areas that are historically underserved is something that's really a mission for Indigo. But there's no right one or two answers here. And as Torsha and Frank said, we need to come at this from a lot of different angles. We have our work cut out for us.
I think you're spot on, Jeannette, there, that it's not one or two right answers. It is a kitchen sink of answers. And I know our system on street and trail network really needs to be reflective of all of us, from the programming to if you're using as a family alone, where they are, it's got to speak to everybody. So in our current administration, infrastructure is a big topic. And of course, we are all wringing our hands to see what happens here. I'm curious what each of you, I'm sure you're watching it closely, and I'm wondering with the current proposal, how you see that affecting trail and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. I'll toss it out to anyone who wants to speak first.
Well, so I'll talk about it from the state perspective, and certainly, we've been looking at the various proposals that started even, in the previous administration and around the renewal of the FAST Act and what it is that could help support trails. One of the issues we have in Pennsylvania is that it's very difficult to get trails onto the tip. And so, in much of the language around how do we get projects to be shovel ready, tip is the easiest way to make things shovel ready. So we're at a disadvantage. So PEC is working with DCNR and PennDOT to figure out if there's an alternate to that so that we can help sort of boost projects around the state that could benefit from this if this manna from heaven arrives. But in the meantime, we continue to work through a bunch of different avenues. And one of the concerns, and I actually saw somebody ask this in the chat, relatively speaking, it's easier to get funding for construction than it is for ongoing maintenance. And again, that gets to the idea that what we saw last year was that trails were critical infrastructure for many people. And it's, how do we change the narrative around that? And how do we advance the idea of we need to be planning for these things in the exact same way that we plan for our road networks? So the conversation's starting. We'll see where it leads, but pretty hopeful about the proposals that are out there. And certainly, Torsha can bring up what RTC has been working on, because I think it'd be really beneficial for us if it occurs. So.
Sure. So I think, first of all, we are all very hopeful that it's a step in the right direction in the American Jobs Plan that's out there with over $5 billion on inactive transportation, the RAISE grants, formerly the BUILD or the Tiger grants. The two key words are sustainability and equity, and trails should perform pretty high on both of those measures. And we know that this administration is focused on breaking down the barriers that had previously disrupted communities, breaking down highways, connecting communities. And I think all of the signs point to very positive infrastructure improvements, But as we all know, that it's almost easier said than done, that there are so many systems in place to kind of rebuild it from the ground up will take a lot of systemic changes. And each of us have a role kind of to play on with it. But I do think that the administration needs to focus on increasing the transportation alternative funds that's available, the pot, that basically is less than 2% of the total transportation pot that they have. Whereas we have seen such a high increase or demand in these for these facilities. So definitely increasing that pot, preventing any kind of transfers away from these pots to building highways, roads, and bridges, that could go a long way. In our mind, looking at the recreational trails program, that's one of the few funds that you can put towards maintenance. So we're hoping that, because maintenance is not glamorous, there's not a lot of pots dedicated to it, but it's so important, especially with increased usage. Maintenance has become one of the major things that trail managers are asking for help from us. So I think keeping in mind that we need to increase the pot, but also prevent leakage from the pot that exists currently, and focusing in this interconnectedness of trail networks. If they can do that instead of funding piecemeal trails, that would go, I think, a long way in creating a safe space for all of us.
I'm so encouraged and inspired to hear about the work that both your organizations are doing, because I think you're right on the money in terms of reframing trail and active transportation as something that needs to be prioritized as much as other modes. So we all know that isn't an easy argument or message for most people to swallow, right? From a more local perspective, though, what I'm encouraged by also is some of the earmark applications that we're putting in, and we don't know what has been accepted or what's going to go forward, but being involved in some of those applications, I know that there's a strong focus on closing a lot of our trail gaps, and also closing and upgrading a lot of facilities that we already have. So making sure that something that looks and functions as temporary right now, or is easy to block, if we're talking about a high quality bike network or a protected bike lane, kind of upgrading those facilities so more folks will feel comfortable using them. And then also looking at the opportunities for the projected paving season with this funding that's coming from the national and state level. That's where I look for our opportunities to, concurrently improve our on-road connections to other high-quality bike networks and to trail. So I think there, hopefully, crossing fingers, going to be a lot of things that we can change in the coming year or two on this issue.
Great, thanks everybody. And I want to take a moment to also add that at least regionally, excited that next month our DVRPC board is going to be voting on 3 new trails added to the tip, which is very exciting, as Kevin points out. So it's hard to get on the tip, so fingers crossed next month. So Christina's added in on the chat. Feel free, everybody, to add in some questions of your own. Our panelists have shared so much. We want to hear from you. So I guess while you type in some questions in the chat to see what you'd like to ask of Torsha, Jeannette, and Frank, I'll just throw one more question out there, which is, do you think, given the changes that you've seen in this enthusiasm on trails and people walking, biking, and using them all the time, whole families out, do you, if you were a gambler, would you gamble on this continuing? Do you think that this is here to stay, this activity?
There are a few times that I'm an optimist, and this is definitely one of them. So, I mean, I think the pattern has been that there have been these moments that we've seen dramatic increase in sort of changes in bicycle use. and sort of the spirit of it. And it's one of the reasons that we wanted to do our follow-up to the fall or to the spring survey last year, was just to see if it really continued. Because I think, particularly if we, anecdotally, we probably all saw families out on trails. And so kids through the summer who are not in their traditional, after school activities and going to camps and things like that, if they spent their summer riding a bike, it's a pretty good basis that they've now spent, 10 to 7% of their lifespan riding a bike, that they are going to keep that pattern with them. We do know that these are the kinds of habits people adopt early, and it forms the rest of their life. So I think, there'll be some drop off, but we're pretty excited and bullish on the fact that it's going to continue. And I do think that the discovery part of what happened last year, we heard lots of anecdotal evidence about people saying, I didn't realize this was here, and I didn't realize I could go here on this place, or that it connected this. Those are the kinds of things that people are going to wonder what's next after that first discovery. So yeah, I think that, coupled with, the bicycle sale numbers and what they're expecting, the bicycle industry and the outdoor industry are definitely projecting that this will increase or continue for a while.
I would hope so too, and I want to point to something that Frank said in one of our pre-discussions, which is, this is an opportunity for folks to try out their routes to work, or their routes to shopping, or their routes to daycare in an active transportation setting where they don't have as much time pressure crunch. And I know that's certainly true for me, not having my commute in the mix anymore. And if we're able to match that with more investment and continuing the push to close those gaps, that folks might feel, comfortable for, a mile or two, but uncomfortable for half a mile, depending on, what those gaps may be in the high quality kind of connections. I'm optimistic as well, especially if we can work on it from both ends, from encouragement, from increasing the safety of the infrastructure.
Well, looking into my crystal ball, I think we all are hoping at this point that this surge that we are seeing will last. But as is expected with all kinds of behaviors, people tend to fall back to the mean and go back to their usual behavior, especially as commuting starts. It takes a lot of time to get to and from your workplace. If you cannot incorporate active commuting into your workplace, then it's another chunk of time that none of us have. People working non-traditional hours, for them, that's an additional challenge. People who have cut down going to movie theaters, meeting up with friends, once those facilities open up, they'll go back to doing that. That would, again, see a drop in trail usage. So given that all of these things will happen, we also have the positives. That one, as Frank mentioned, that once you're introduced to something good, you want to go out and experience that. So people who have dusted off their bikes in a long time, they're more likely to keep doing it. Kids that are already being introduced, they're going to nag their parents to hopefully take them out. So as long as it's almost on us to make sure that these small barriers that people have, they don't prevent people from coming. So making trails a more social place for people to gather instead of going somewhere else in a restaurant, maybe that can be a good thing in terms of programming, marketing trails that we could look at to sustain this positive behavior.
Thank you, everybody. I'm optimistic too. And I think, this extra time really is key, Torsha, that we're have to be able to explore. So let's hope some of it can continue. Christina, is there anything you're seeing in the chat that you want to bring up?
There were like 3 comments that I'm going to sort of bracket together. There was one comment about too many bikes on sidewalks in Center City, and then someone had a comment about bikes on trains. And as more people sort of get back to commuting, does that need to be reevaluated? And then someone else brought up, there's too many cars in Center City that are constantly blocking sidewalks and parking on sidewalks and blocking crosswalks and everything like that. So I guess I wanted to lump them all together into a general category about all of these different modes. There are sometimes conflicts between modes, and how do we handle that in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are always going to be trade-offs, right? There are folks that are going to say, if there are too many bikes on the train, that because folks want to do that last mile instead of those 20 miles, on a bike, they want to do, some of it on the train and then some of it on the bike. What are the trade-offs there? And that's more of a separate conversation of how many cars are available, right? Especially with the spacing. I don't know if you folks have been on regional rail lately, but my husband takes it every day, and there are spacing constraints right now. So that's a good question. But when we look at this could be a very long answer, so I'll try to make it short. When we look at trade-offs with Center City traffic, we want to encourage active transportation, and we really have to look at level of service in an urban context and remember that to make sure that we're not treating all all traffic the same. There's supposed to be some delay in Center City, and we've been lucky. We are lucky right now that we can easily drive in Center City. Most cities can't do that. If you think of New York City, if you think of any other big city, you can't drive in and park for an hour for $4. So what are our priorities in Center City, and how do we carry that forth to infrastructure and policy? So these are bigger discussions we have. I don't have the answers for you, but we are looking at things a little bit differently these days.
To turn the question a little bit too, there's also this whole question of, with all these new users, how do we communicate these sort of rules of the trail, the ethics of being out, and to the idea of cyclists riding against traffic or running traffic lights, or all those things that get thrown out. The real question is, like, how are we communicating to these people and still continuing to make it a welcoming conversation and not one that's elitist, just to put it bluntly. There's a lot of conversations around the ethics of leave no trace that are more focused on backcountry, and how do we bring those into the front country to these new users without it being an exclusivity thing. So I don't have an answer on that, but there's a lot of conversations going on around it, trying to figure out the best ways to do it, using social media or things like that to try and get it ingrained into people that these are all public assets, and as a participant in a civil society, you need to understand the basics of what it means. So it's an ongoing conversation. So.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I don't think any of us has the answer to solve that. But I do think with the advent of micromobility, we see a lot of young users on scooters, and there's a lot of hesitancy and resistance from lawmakers to allow these scooters on roadways or sidewalks. So they literally don't have a space to operate. People are talking about regulating their speeds when we are not talking about cars at all. So I think there is a very different ways we judge cars versus any other non-motorized transportation. So that lens needs to change. The amount of space, real estate that is devoted to parking, whether it's surface or constructed on street or parking garages, it's ridiculous. So, and especially when we are having a lack of affordable housing. So this kind of opens up a can of worms or solutions, possible solutions that we can look at in solving multiple problems in the society, that with just refocusing our city design for the pedestrian. And then once we do that, it'll automatically be safer for bicyclists, for scooter users, and even for car users. So if you look at the most vulnerable group, and and designed for them, it should work for everybody on top of that. And I think having that conversation is important now when we are talking about networks. So those transit to bike to train, all of those interconnectedness, payment interconnectedness. Maybe you have a universal card that kind of is accepted in bike shares and transit, so that reduces barriers to entry. Similarly, a reduction in rates for people who might have difficulty in accessing that due to the cost prohibitive nature of that. So there are so many things that we can do. There are really small steps and changes in policy at the local level that we can do that can actually serve as carrots to maintaining these positive behaviors, and a little bit of a stick on the other end, that no free parking in the CBD zones to make it safer for everybody.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. So following up on your sort of description, Torsha, of all of these like little local changes that we can make that make a big difference, we have a question about, with all of the upcoming excitement of trails added to the tip, what are some unique design features and innovative ideas that have been incorporated into design?
You know, one thing I would say that there's not a lot of new tech things, but just basic things like wayfinding and signage, places to sit, shaded places to sit, water fountains. If you can have those basic things, those go a long, long way to encouraging people. And when it comes to crossings of trails with roads or trains, making sure that they're safe. So I think these are not like state-of-the-art thing, or we just found it out about it yesterday. We know about these things for a long time, and these things are basic. But it's sad to say that not a lot of trails have these basic amenities. So I think these are the good things to have.
Yeah, I would echo some of what.
I'd point to.
Go ahead, Jeannette.
Go ahead, sorry.
Nope, your turn.
Oh, thank you. I'd point to what we see in a more constrained space, right? So a lot of the gaps that we're trying to fill, whether they're trail gaps or on-road gaps, are space constrained. So again, as Torsha said, these aren't new infrastructure types in general, but they are new for Philadelphia. If you go look at what the work that DRWC has done on the Delaware River Trail between Spring Garden and Washington, so that's under construction right now, but opening this year, and they've done some stellar design work that's basically a path next to sidewalk, and we're so lucky to have some really great groups like DRWC and SRDC that have the financial ability and staff ability to kind of go to that next level. And I think that's the model for what we'd like to do in other places in the city.
And I was just going to follow up in terms of, to commend DVRPC and all the work that's happening on the circuit trails, because one of the biggest things compared to my work in the rest of Pennsylvania that you all have that the rest of the state could learn from is an overarching vision for what you're trying to do and creating the standards and trying to follow through on them, in addition to the wayfinding and all those sorts of resources. One of the biggest things that's a challenge to new users and just kind of getting people to go experience new things is consistency, and knowing that if wherever they start, where they end up, they know what they're getting themselves into. We wouldn't expect roads to function in the way that our trails function. So why do we allow that to continue in terms of, ever-changing widths, signage, color schemes, and direction where they're taking you, those sorts of things. I think it's definitely, you're way ahead of the rest of the state, but there's still room for improvement in the Southeast, so.
I just wanted to chime in with a response on this one too. And it actually, Christina, doesn't have much to do with the design of the trail itself, but more kind of organically and crowdsourced how people are using them. So I think in the last year, just the way we use them, like people creating rides just to go to a new brewery for a ride, and they're gathering with friends to make that ride to go get beer together, and it's a social connection. And also having apps where you can compare your ride to other people. You know, people are using Strava to show people what they did and share it. And I think somebody on a call earlier mentioned Montgomery County's program. Shout out to Montgomery County if you're on, but I think, and maybe it was you, Frank, who said, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but there was something where if you were on the trail system, there was like a program where if you took a selfie there and here, and it was sort of like a scavenger hunt, if you will, of taking pictures in various places that you were entered into a raffle or something like that. So I think these are really new and innovative ways that people themselves are coming up with to use trails and to make a game out of it and make it fun and social. So I love seeing these things advance.
Great. Yeah, that was the Montgomery County Trail Challenge, and I just posted the link in the chat in case anyone is interested in looking that up.
Awesome. Thank you.
So we have some comments in the chat. Let's see. About, I guess, like safety and enforcement. So bicycles are considered vehicles in Pennsylvania and most states. And so I guess, how do people feel about bikes should not be on the sidewalk in any instance? Comments on bikes being perceived as vehicles.
I mean, I guess my reaction to that is the reason people ride on the sidewalks is that's where they feel safe. And they actually are putting themselves more at risk for more interactions that are unpredictable, but that's not the perception. So until we have a network that people feel comfortable using, that they know it gets them from point A to point B, if that's their goals, those opportunities are going to start out that way. I started out as a bike commuter in Washington, D.C., and I remember riding to my job 2.5 miles away, almost entirely on sidewalks. A year and a half later, I started working as a bike messenger and did that for 4 years. And so I got over the hurdle of riding in traffic, but that was a pretty big jump, and I was 22 and stupid. So we can't ask that of everybody.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, first of all, it's entirely true. Bikes should not be on the sidewalk, especially in, Center City, unless you're under 12, right? But I'm reminded of riding in Seattle with some of their folks. They were showing me around some of their trails and protected bikeway facilities. And, the rule in Seattle is that you can be on the sidewalk if you are a biker, but you must yield to everyone else, right? And so it wasn't as cut and dry as in Philadelphia. And I think what Frank said is exactly right, that folks are riding on the sidewalk because they don't feel safe in the street. So that is really just a nod to the importance of on-road high-quality facilities. Because if you provide that, that's where folks are going to go. We have our work cut out for us.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. All of this share the road, keeping safe distances, they only work on paper. They do not actually work when somebody is rash driving, trying to get to their office on time and yelling at a bicyclist. So anybody, if they have access to a straightforward, short distance, safe route, not something that you have to take a detour to get on a trail that's like that adds 5 miles to your whole commute. Of course, they'll then skip and try to get on the shortest route if the road is the shortest connection. But that only works for fearless bicyclists. For the majority of us, I think that does not work. And although I would not advocate people for going on sidewalks, but if you think of pedestrians and bicyclists clashing with each other, it might be a serious accident. Both can be hurt. But when you're talking about a bicyclist and car collision, because of the mass and the speed, we are talking about death. So there's very different scales of accidents that we are talking about, not accidents, collisions that we are talking about. that could be prevented. So I think as long as cars are still, streets are still only kind of seen as space for cars, we have to come to expect sharing of other space between so many different users, strollers, wheelchairs, pedestrians, and bicyclists or scooters. So if we don't want to do that, we have to carve out space from the road, safe space.
Great. We are approaching the end of our time, so we'll take this last one. This question is for Torsha or Frank, but Jeannette and Betsy, feel free to chime in too. Have you worked with established organizations to partner on programming for populations that you surveyed who don't feel welcome on trails? And the person who wrote this is a member of a 1 million strong organization of African American women called Girls Trek. They've been around for 10 years and they have trained local organizers to lead hikes on trails and urban hikes throughout their neighborhoods. Another organization is Outdoor Afro, which is again, people of color hiking and doing outdoor activities, and Walk PHL is an organization hitting trails and urban walking.
So Vanessa of Girl Trek is our board member, and she's just awesome, seriously. But one thing, just to kind of a shout out for Girl Trek, is what they have been successful in doing that public health officials, policymakers have not been, is to get people out on trails. And the way they have been successful is talking about relating walking to empowerment, to the history, and how it can be freeing and empowering to people in communities. And really hats off for that very successful way in connecting communities and empowering women to be on trails. That said, what we have worked with is we are working currently with Baltimore, in Baltimore, looking at the Baltimore Trail Network and making sure that the trail actually serves the needs of the community. When the trail is completed, making sure it reflects the history in terms of if we want to put any kind of pictures or mapping or just wayfinding signage so that it's reflective and symbolizes what this trail or this space stood for. Kind of a storytelling experience as people walk on the trail. We have also worked in Brownsville, Texas, where we have worked with people who have never thought of going out on trails. And this is a community with a very high diabetes rate, a very low physical activity rate. What worked for them is having bike workshops, having food trucks, farmer market out on there, having leaflets in Spanish language, making sure that we are not talking down to any community. We are talking as a partner and working with the community, speaking their language, being there, almost trying to get them to experience trails for the first time. And once they do it, it's kind of, oh my God, I can do this. And this is a fun thing that I can do. That opens up a whole world of experiences to people who are apprehensive about whether the trail is for them or not. So we have been working, even in our Capital Trails Coalition in Maryland, Washington, DC, and Virginia, we have been trying to actively conduct focus groups and talk to these people because there are real safety concerns about police enforcement. There are also perceived safety about people who don't look like me. So looking at all of the real and perceived safety concerns, talking to them and addressing them is a major part of the work that we are currently doing.
So my quick answer on the Pennsylvania Environmental Council is that we're not an organization that does a lot of programming, but we work with a lot of groups that then go out and do the programming. And we could certainly do more in the outreach. And one example is actually we are through the Water Trails program that's mentioned that we're the managing partner for the statewide Water Trails program. We're partnering with Outdoor Afro to, we basically provided a mini grant to provide 2 different trips through Outdoor Afro this year, but we're always interested in other groups. One of the projects I would point to is the work on the 58th Street Greenway in Philadelphia. This is a section of the East Coast Greenway. And, you know, it's a little bit of a cautionary tale for a few reasons. But in the initial conversations about it, going to the community and talking about, we're coming in with a trail, we're going to build a trail here, it was nowhere on the list of what the community wanted. But what they did want was, an extra 4 feet in front of their townhouses that they could actually let kids play in. They wanted lights. There had never, the street had not been paved in a long time. And so thinking about those things, about working with the community to deliver on their needs and what their hopes were, we can call it a trail, but the community actually views how it's used and how they're actually engaging with it. When that is connected to the rest of the network, it'll be a different experience. But it's just that sort of like how we approach the work that we do and make sure that we're not sort of overlaying our plans for what we want, but really seeing like what it is that's going to get the community engaged and get them excited about the work. So.
Great. Well, I do see that it is 1:12 and we promised to get you out of here by 1:15. So I am going to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. It's been really amazing to be a part of it. And I'm going to toss it back to Erica for a few closing remarks and upcoming WTS Philadelphia events. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Yes, a special thanks to Betsy, Torsha, Frank, and Jeannette, and also Christina and Kelly for planning this great event. In regards to upcoming WTS Philadelphia events, on Friday, May 7th, we have a joint SMPS and WTS event in the morning called Team Changer, the effects of DEI on procurement and winning strategies. We hope to see everyone there. A reminder that the week of May 10th is the WTS International Conference. It's being held virtual and registration is still open. And then a sneak peek on June 8th, we have a multi-chapter event that will look at the American Jobs Plan and infrastructure priorities for our region. One last final reminder, our chapter is accepting applications for the next cycle of our Emerging Leaders program. Emerging Leaders was created as a forum for professional women in the early stages of their transportation careers. The application deadline is Friday, May 14th. If you have specific questions about Emerging Leaders, you can contact our director, Colleen Noss, at emergingleaders@wtsphiladelphia.org. Thanks again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.